Welcome to the NT Podcast, Science and Theology Podcast. My name is Nemanja Jurišić, and today's guest is Dr. Aaron Hornkohl from the University of Cambridge, an expert in biblical Hebrew and the history of the Hebrew language. So, Professor Hornkohl, welcome.
Thank you, Nemanja. It's very nice to be here, to be invited, and I'm glad we could finally schedule a time when we were both available.
Oh, yes, it took a few months to manage this, but thank you very much. I'm really privileged because, you're really expert in this field. So we will talk about Hebrew language and its development. So, I prepared some questions for you, Professor Hornkohl, but can you say for the introduction for people that maybe don't know you, your background, what are you doing, and maybe about your book that is available free, so anything to add?
Yeah, so I grew up in the United States, in Southern California. I was very interested in languages in general, and got interested in classical Hebrew. I got interested in classical Hebrew through the interest in languages, but also eventually interest in Bible translation. I grew up in a Christian setting, environment, and I still attend a church today with my family here in the UK. So most of my training was actually done in Israel. I got good advice early in my academic career that Israel would be a good place to pursue Hebrew studies. I didn't understand at the time exactly what I was getting into, but I was fortunate enough to have that good advice. And so we, that is my wife and I, and eventually our kids, spent 12 years living in Israel. I did my master's and PhD at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, which was quite a privilege. It was not easy. The studies were not easy. I wrote my dissertation in Hebrew, having had to learn modern Hebrew along the way. And but that was very helpful for me, not just to get grounded in Hebrew in general, but also for future job opportunities, because in my current position here in Cambridge, I teach both modern and classical Hebrew, although most of my research is on classical Hebrew.
Wow, amazing. So can you tell us something more about Cambridge? Is it difficult to you, and how is it to, be in that position?
So I really enjoy being in Cambridge. We've been here now for almost 13 years. Cambridge is a very nice place to live. I have nice colleagues. It's quite a competitive university to get into as a student. And in my faculty is the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. We're not the only faculty that offers Hebrew here. There's also the Faculty of Divinity. So in the Faculty of Divinity, you could study classical Hebrew, biblical, or rabbinic Hebrew. In our faculty, you can study all different chronolects of Hebrew, different phases of the Hebrew language. We have very few students at the undergraduate level, only between 1 and 3 per year. At the undergraduate level, we have more graduate level students. So it's a very, very small subject, and it's a subject that students often do combining with one of our other languages, or maybe historically European language. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Hornkohl. And now let's tackle some questions about the intersection of linguistics and the biblical studies. So what is the earliest form of the Hebrew language? Some scholars suggest that Hebrew emerged around 1100 BCE, but there are parts that may date back to 1150 or maybe 1200 BC, such as the Song of Miriam, Song of Deborah, and other passages. So can you tell us more?
Yeah, so you start with a very good question that's also a very thorny question. And, there's a difference between what I suppose or what I speculate about and what I can actually argue for and prove. So I think a lot of scholars would agree that within the Bible you have some very ancient poetry in the Torah, in the Pentateuch, and in the former prophets. So as you mentioned, Song of Deborah, Shirat Hayam, so that's Exodus 15, and a few other portions in the Pentateuch and then in the former prophets, and maybe some sections also in the Psalms and the latter prophets as well. So they're sometimes, their language is sometimes referred to as archaic biblical Hebrew. Not everybody agrees on that, or even if they agree on the terminology, the categorization, they wouldn't necessarily agree on what that means. So there are some scholars who continue to hold that those passages are actually older than the surrounding narratives, and their language looks typologically older because, yes, they're older texts. And then there are other scholars who would say maybe the texts are no older than the surrounding narratives, but by virtue of the fact that they're poetry, and poetry in lots of languages is highly conservative and often archaic, they simply contain accumulations of particularly archaic features, but maybe they're not older than the surrounding narratives. So my own view is that yes, I'm comfortable with the idea that some of these, maybe not all, but some of them are authentically old pieces of literature, older than the surrounding narratives, and that they have been incorporated into the narratives. And I'm comfortable with the idea that yes, their language is authentically older than the language of the surrounding narratives. Having said that, it's also clear that they, they have been through some process of integration into the surrounding narratives, and then the entire poetry and narrative together has also been through some process, some secondary processes, whether it's updating of their spelling or updating of their language or possibly content as well. I don't know. So I think within the Bible you can see some texts that have features that look archaic, and it is very possible that they preserve a linguistic stratum from before what we call classical biblical Hebrew. And so yes, they could go back to what, like you said here, the 12th century BCE. I struggle actually when we come to chronological dates, absolute chronology, and we'll come back to that later. Now, outside the Bible, you also have some things that look very old. The Gezer calendar is often raised as a potentially old Hebrew source. Now, it wouldn't be as old as what we just talked about, evidently. And there are questions about whether it actually qualifies as Hebrew. And that's not an unimportant question. When does Hebrew actually start? I was having a conversation with Chris Hayes the other day, and he suggested, I think correctly, that we probably can talk about Hebrew as Hebrew when there's a political entity called Israel that exists and has developed a scribal tradition and politics that are behind the language. That doesn't mean that there wasn't something Hebrew-like, Proto-Hebrew, or Canaanite, whatever you want to call it, before that time. I suspect there were many, many dialects, and one of them is the one that led to classical biblical Hebrew. And probably there were stories and poems and songs in those dialects. But I also suspect that the situation was much more varied. And when we actually get to what we call classical biblical Hebrew or standard biblical Hebrew, the very fact that it's standardized, that we can tell that it's pretty much all from the same place and pretty much all from the same time, is because there was some kind of cultural political force that was shaping old texts and texts that were being written at the time, and in some ways homogenizing them. So the Gezer calendar doesn't look. I mean, it's readable. I mean, we can tell that it's a Semitic language closely related to Hebrew. Whether the person who composed it, what they called their language, and to the extent to which they would have connected that to some political reality in which they were living, I mean, that's a question for. It's an interesting question, but I can only speculate on it. It's just we just don't have the data.
Yes, very interesting. I had Professor Stephen Ortiz. He excavated Tel Gezer, so he would agree with you that we don't quite know is it Hebrew that calendar or something else. So yeah, there is a debate. But okay, so did it end in 1000 BCE, archaic Hebrew language, with the monarchy rise of Davidic kingdom? Or yeah.
Well, to some extent, as I mentioned, biblical Hebrew poetry continues to have signs of an archaic stratum, even into what we consider the classical period. So Isaiah is certainly not archaic biblical Hebrew. Wherever you are in Isaiah, chapters 1 through 39 or chapters 40 through the end, even the earliest portions of Isaiah, they're not archaic biblical Hebrew, but they certainly contain poetic features that you don't find in the narrative section, which have the look of typologically early features. So, in a sense, you have to draw a line someplace. And what often happens in historical linguistics, and this is understandable, but it's also a little bit problematic, is we tend to draw our chronological boundaries not on the basis of when linguistic change actually happened, because we can't tell exactly when linguistic change happened. It's not an overnight process. And you can't tell based on just one feature. You have to look at a lot of features. But we tend to do it based on corresponding historical events. So, for example, in the history of biblical Hebrew, the establishment of the monarchy is one such event. The exile or the restoration, those are events with which we can associate changes. Now, whether those events, whether the years that those events happened should be the specific moment, all right, that's probably not the case, because the change is going to be gradual. Most changes are gradual, and the boundaries are going to be quite fuzzy. And also our data, our texts, they're snapshots here and there, even in the best of situations, even if they're preserved, everything is preserved, all the details are preserved, and no one thinks that's the case. But we have snapshots here and there imperfect snapshots, and so we're trying to make sense of them based on the linguistic data and based on the historical events that we know about that we think could have led to these linguistic changes, or could have been associated with the linguistic changes. But it's very difficult to tell gradual change. When should you draw the boundary? So any dates that I give you today or have written on in my books, I've been very reluctant to, and I continue to be very reluctant to give dates. Part of that is the nature of the material and the nature of the argument, and part of it is a certain reluctance in myself to, because I'm very aware that there are lots of factors that need to be considered, and I'm quite sensitive to the linguistic considerations, whereas some colleagues are much more sensitive to evidence from other directions. And I don't think that one should be privileged over the other. And it's very difficult for me, or I think for anybody, to keep in mind all of these different factors and to prioritize them and weigh them in a way that's reasonable and compelling. So I think we're all just trying to contribute something of value to the field and hoping that future generations will use our data in a good way, be able to integrate them together and come up with a compelling kind of argument.
Beautiful. Thank you again, Professor Hornkohl. You implied one problem that we have also, that poetry is often written in older fashion. So I asked one rabbi, and he would say, even today, we write something that we want to look older. So maybe they were writing later, but they are using older language. What do you think about that?
Yeah, to some extent that's possible, and not just in poetry. I attended a church service here several years ago where it was very common for participants in the service to pray using language, English language, that they would never use on the street or at home. They used pronouns and verb forms in reference to God, speaking to God, that they don't use on a regular basis. Now, some of them did so correctly because they'd inherited a tradition. Some of them didn't. They would make mistakes. They would use the correct pronoun but the wrong verb form. Now, they simply had incorrect acquisition of the tradition. So, and by the way, I wouldn't be able to do this myself. I'm a native speaker of English, but I'm not a native speaker of pre-modern English. I can't do that. I can fake it a little bit, but unless someone is really an expert on, I don't know, Shakespeare or some form of literature, and they can imitate this, I think that would be really difficult. So, generally speaking, I think that some amount of imitation of pre-classical style, or if you're in the late period, classical style, is to be expected. I think that's quite normal. Perfect imitation, or imitation that you can't discover, you can't see, you can't perceive, that's probably rarer, even in the case of biblical Hebrew, until that is, and this is an important point, until you have a canon. Now, I'm told, and I believe this, that at a certain point in history, after the Quran had become canonized, there were scholars, Quranic scholars, who could write in flawless Quranic Arabic. Now, I don't have any problem believing that, and I suspect that there were, and probably still are, people very well versed in biblical Hebrew who can reproduce flawless biblical Hebrew. But both of those situations assume a scenario in which the respective canon exists and there's no disagreement on it, and you just learn by rote how biblical Hebrew or Quranic Arabic works. But the periods that we're talking about, all the way up until the latest period in which a biblical text could have been composed, they don't have a canon yet. The canon is in the process of being formed. I suspect there are some texts that have crystallized. I suspect the Torah crystallized rather early, and so one might argue that on the basis of the Torah or something, someone could have imitated Torah-style Hebrew. But one of the interesting things is there isn't really anything that looks exactly like the Torah. This is, in fact, my latest book points this out, that the Torah's Hebrew is actually different in some ways, even from other forms of classical biblical Hebrew, consistently. And so I think the argument in imitation, it does carry some weight, but at a certain point it breaks down. And even if you say, all right, maybe once in a while some very gifted person could have imitated the previous chronolective Hebrew, I think it's very possible over a short period of text. I think it gets much more unlikely over long stretches of text. And then if you say that this was, if you make it your claim that this was generally possible, that anybody could do this, then I think it becomes highly, highly unlikely. Maybe gifted people exceptionally, something like that. But generally speaking, I don't see that as a viable theory. But I recognize that there are scholars who do. There are reputable scholars who do.
Great points. Thank you again. So, how many major periods do we distinguish when discussing biblical Hebrew? You talked about that in your book, so can you tell us more? Ben Sommer would say that there is archaic Hebrew, classical biblical Hebrew, late classical Hebrew, and the post-exilic. So, would you agree with that or no?
Yeah, it depends on how you break it down. So I think I would insist, at the very least, that we recognize classical biblical Hebrew and late biblical Hebrew. Within biblical Hebrew, of course, there is Hebrew after the Bible as well, quite a bit of it. But I would say we all should kind of accept the difference between classical biblical Hebrew and late biblical Hebrew. And late biblical Hebrew should probably be considered the Hebrew that's post-restoration. That means after the exile. If you want to divide them into two, that's how I would do it, and I would say that's got the most evidence for it, and probably the most agreement. And by the way, even people who would say that it was possible for someone in the late period to mimic classical biblical Hebrew, they would still argue that by and large there is this difference. The books that we know are late, the material that we know is late. It does have language that differs appreciably from other material, and they would, unless they just want to call it late and standard or late and early, however they want to call it, most people would agree with this. Now, we already talked about whether someone wants to admit that there's archaic biblical Hebrew, that's an actual stratum of material. Some people again would say yes, that the ancient poems are written in archaic biblical Hebrew and they are authentically ancient. Other people would say, well, they're probably classical texts, but because they're poetry, they preserve archaic features in a special way that we don't see in other poetry. I don't have any problem myself breaking things into three and more. You'll hear in a moment, but I would find it difficult to prove to someone. Whereas I think I would feel like I have good evidence for the division between classical and late biblical Hebrew. Now, if you want to become very, very detailed about differences, I have written, and some other people have written, on kind of late pre-exilic and exilic and maybe early post-exilic texts that don't look exactly like late biblical Hebrew. They have the initial signs of late biblical Hebrew, but not in the right accumulations to be considered late biblical Hebrew. And so I have referred to transitional biblical Hebrew. Whether people find that useful or not, I'm not certain. There are a minority of scholars who certainly accept that. Other scholars have responded more negatively or more skeptically, and I think most scholars just kind of ignore the entire question. So I'm not sure how to the extent to which that's accepted. Now, most recently, so this is my most recent monograph. After having done some other research over the years and collecting examples, primarily examples of linguistic features that didn't quite fit the dominant theory. So that showed constellations or distributions that were off. I suggested in a recent book, and I'm not the only one to suggest this. Elitzur has also suggested this in a number of articles. I suggested that within classical biblical Hebrew, we can see linguistic differences between what I referred to as classical biblical Hebrew 1 and classical biblical Hebrew 2. Now, that for me and for Elitzur, these are we've kind of just over the last few years been proposing. Well, Elitzur has been doing it for a few years, and then I did it in this book. This idea, and the scholarly reception is not clear to me. I don't know what people think of that. Both in terms of relative chronology, I don't know if scholars are what they're thinking about this relative chronology, if it's heuristically useful, if it is acceptable, and even more the absolute kind of dating. But generally speaking, I see a linguistic difference in minor points, and it's important for me to say this, between the classical biblical Hebrew of the Pentateuch and the classical biblical Hebrew that's outside the Pentateuch. Now, I want to add something very important here. The general distinction between late biblical Hebrew and classical biblical Hebrew still holds. Whether you want to admit transitional biblical Hebrew or archaic biblical Hebrew, that's still the dominant paradigm. It's the most useful paradigm. It's the most solid paradigm. And generally speaking, if I look from Genesis all the way till the end of Kings, along with some of who are generally considered the pre-exilic prophets, notwithstanding differences in genre, poetry, and things like this, linguistically, it's generally all the same. So from what people tend to call the primary history from Genesis to Kings is generally all classical biblical Hebrew. Most features are shared the same typological age. Now, that suggests that from the Pentateuch until the end of Kings is from approximately all the same period. So for me, that means Iron Age 2, and let's just say from 1000 to 600, about. So there are two things that come out of that. One is that for anybody who claims that the Torah, as it stands, as it's written, the extant Pentateuch today, is written in a Hebrew far, far earlier than the Hebrew of, say, Judges and Samuel and Joshua and Kings, I don't think that that's tenable. I don't think that that pans out. The language is quite similar. The Torah, as we have it today, looks to have been produced in the monarchic period. Now, I'm not talking about the traditions that the Torah contains. I'm talking about the way it's written. It looks like the Hebrew of Judges, Samuel, Kings, approximately. However, so that's the majority of features. But there are minority of features, and when I say minority of features, I'm talking fewer than 20 features. But maybe there are more. Maybe we just haven't found them yet. Fewer than 20 linguistic features, plus or minus maybe a few more if we find them, along with some other features that show that consistently the Torah is slightly typologically earlier than the rest of classical biblical Hebrew texts outside the Torah. So that suggests to me that while the Torah as we have it, the Pentateuch as we have it, probably contains older material, it was substantially composed in Iron Age 2 in the monarchic period, presumably at an earlier period than the former prophets or the rest of CBH. Now, exactly where to draw the border between those two, I mean, I've suggested the first half and the second half, which is basically 1000 to 800 and then 800 to 600. I did that very reluctantly and hesitantly in my book, and I still feel very reluctant and hesitant about that. I felt like I had to say something because it's not fair just to give a theory and not be specific. But I've had some recent conversations with Chris Hayes, I said, and Benjamin Suchard, who's written a blog recently where he reviews my book. And they have some good questions and some good considerations, which I'm contemplating, and I need to hear from other people as well.
Wow, so that means that the Torah as a whole would fit that period from 1000 BC to 800 BC, if that's CBH1.
Yeah, I mean, so maybe 800 is too early. Maybe it should go a little bit later. But yeah, that's what it looks like to me. Whenever CBH1 is from, and I assume 1000 is the earliest date, its final point is going to be approximately, before CBH2. So yeah, I don't know where to put that. As I said, I've put that at 800. I'm not sure that that's a good date. I'm not especially comfortable with that date, but I don't have any other solid date in mind either. So I'm just going to stick with that for the time being, and hope that I or somebody else come up with either confirmation or a better datation.
Yes, thank you. So, what do you think about theory of Professor Gary Rensburg and Daniel Block, Ben Kilgore, Edwin Yamuch? They would say that Torah is written in the period when there is establishment of a united monarchy, spirituality in the time of David and Solomon. So they would say Torah is written in about 10th century. Is that that's my view, honestly. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't have any linguistic evidence that said that contradicts that. Indeed, my linguistic evidence says that that's entirely possible. Um, there are some gaps in, not just in my knowledge. Of course, there are gaps in my knowledge, but there are gaps in our knowledge in general. One of the strong points for Avi Horowitz's linguistic methodology for distinguishing between classical and late biblical Hebrew is that he has a small amount of control data that he can compare to classical biblical Hebrew. That's Iron Age epigraphy. And he has a huge amount of post-biblical or late extra-biblical material as a comparison for late biblical Hebrew. So our problem is that we don't have much comparative material, extra-biblical material, for pre-monarchic Hebrew, if we can call it Hebrew. That's just a matter of terminology, but I can look at texts from Tel El Amarna. I can look at texts from Eastern Semitics, from Babylon, from Ugaritic, things like that. But I don't really have Canaanite texts, and so I don't have a confirmation from outside the Bible of what pre-monarchic Hebrew Canaanite looked like linguistically, even in terms of the onomasticon, in terms of names. I mean, I make a big deal in my book about names. Names are not exactly the same as other kinds of linguistic data, but names are linguistic in the sense that they're part of the language. And I make a big deal about the fact that the Torah, along with Joshua, Judges, and Samuel, don't have many names with a theophoric component, Yah or Yo or Yahu. Whereas you get to Kings and Isaiah and Jeremiah, and you get this explosion of names, and not just in those biblical books, also in the extra biblical material, not just in long text, but in stamps as well, stamp seals. So you've got this explosion of theophoric names like that with the Yahu component, and in the early monarchic and pre-monarchic Torah texts, you have very few names like that. In fact, you have two. You have Joshua that's used quite a bit, in Joshua especially, and you've got Moses' mother Yocheved. So I make a big deal out of that. I do think I think it's more than just intriguing. I think it does have probative value, but I don't have long lists of names, Canaanite names, Hebrew names from in close proximity with which I can compare the situation in the Torah or Joshua and Judges and Samuel. We just don't have stamp seals from that time period. We don't have long texts from that time period, those time periods. And so that's, and I don't know that we will get them because you expect quite a bit of material culture with writing to be preserved from a period where there's a monarchy. You probably expect less from a pre-monarchic situation, although it's not impossible. And maybe the archaeologists will find something.
Yes, thank you again. Can you give us some examples beside that Yahoo names? That's incredible, really. Do you have any example that Torah has some features that books that are written on classical biblical Hebrew too, from period 600 to 800 BCE, that those books doesn't have?
Yeah, so I think the one that's the most for me is the most compelling piece of evidence. Unfortunately, it's actually quite technical, but I'll try to make sense of it. So biblical Hebrew has what a lot of people call a narrative past tense in what's called vayikol, which is the sequential past tense. And this verb form is known to use, along with the vav that means and, it's known to use a form of the prefix verb, yiktol, that looks like the jussive. So it's the short yiktol. And one of the things that we see throughout the Bible, and you definitely see it between classical biblical Hebrew and late biblical Hebrew, is in the first person. Now, admittedly, we don't have a lot of first person narrative in the Bible, but there is some. In the first person, as time goes on, the forms get longer. So, particularly in weak verbs will show short forms, and in late biblical Hebrew, they'll have long forms. And then in strong verbs, they have the normal form, and then in late biblical Hebrew, they'll have the augmented form, where it looks like the cohortative. It has an extra a vowel on the end. So one of the things that's interesting is that in the Torah, all of the forms are short. The shortness of this in first person is just the norm. And in late biblical Hebrew, you have definite lengthening wherever it's possible. A large percentage of forms you get this lengthening, and in the prophets, the former prophets, that is, in classical biblical Hebrew outside of the Torah, you get a mix. You get weak verbs having kind of the standard form. So instead of va'evin, you get va'evne, so the kind of the longer form. But what you don't get, so that's like late biblical Hebrew. But what you don't get is the strong verbs having this augmented ending. So instead of va'eshmol in late biblical Hebrew, you might get va'eshmera. So you don't get that in the prophets. So and someone might say, well, wait a second, maybe this was just maybe the prophets were once written exactly like the Torah, and but the Torah crystallized early, and people were very conservative because the Torah is the Torah, and so you don't touch it. But the prophets, you can update them a little bit linguistically. You can add a hey here and there. So the reason that and I, by the way, in my book, I try to entertain that possibility that there's sometimes the differences are not linguistic differences, original linguistic differences, they're actually secondary. The scribes did something to the text. But in this case, that just doesn't work, because on the assumption that later scribes would have been willing to add a hey at the end to make va'evin and I built to va'evne and I built, then they should have also added the hey at the end of va'ashmo to make it va'ashmera, and they didn't. So that makes me think that this is an authentic linguistic change. This is something that happened within the language between CBH1 and CBH2. So that's quite a detailed one, and maybe not the easiest to understand. There also another example would be the verbs, the root tzadi chet kuf and zain chet kuf, tzahak and zaak. So these are words that mean to cry out. In the Hifield, mean to muster forces, to call soldiers to battle, to get ready for battle. And this is something that, within the Torah, it uses the form with Sade, and then you get to Joshua, and there's a switch. Joshua Judges is a switch, and then from then on, the form with Zayin becomes much more prevalent, and that continues into late biblical Hebrew and beyond. And so this is a change that. This kind of change is exactly the kind of thing we would expect to happen between classical biblical Hebrew and late biblical Hebrew. And it does happen that is, late biblical Hebrew does do something different, but the change actually seems to happen before late biblical Hebrew. And in this case, some of the classical biblical Hebrew books, specifically Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, they line up with late biblical Hebrew rather than with the classical biblical Hebrew of the Torah. So if it were just one feature, that wouldn't be very meaningful. But when you find this kind of pattern repeating itself in a number of features, then you can start to draw kind of lines, like on a map, that distinguish one kind of classical biblical Hebrew from the other kind of classical biblical Hebrew. Now, that's all relative dating. That's just saying they're typologically different. Again, what you do in terms of absolute chronology, I think that's a much more difficult question, and I'm still thinking about that and hoping to get more feedback from colleagues.
Fascinating. So I cannot imagine how is it to write a dissertation on Hebrew language as you did. So amazing. And I have a question about Samuel and Amos, Hosea. When you read those books, would you say that Torah is a slightly earlier language or maybe the same language? What do you think?
So generally speaking, again, Amos and Hosea are quite poetic, but generally speaking, CBH, Classical Biblical Hebrew, is of a piece. I'm not saying there aren't any distinctions, of course, with genre. There may also be distinctions that have to do with dialect. Some people are more convinced of, say, Northern versus Standard features. I think there is such a thing as Northern Biblical Hebrew. I'm not as optimistic as some in identifying it or identifying Northern text based on it, but I think it is a real thing. But generally speaking, as I said, typologically, diachronically, books like Samuel, the Torah, Amos, Hosea, they should all be they're approximately the same time period. However, what I answered to the previous question stands. Typologically, in terms of the features that I have looked at, and again, there might be other features, and there are other features that a few other people have looked at, the Torah stands alone. The Torah is different from the Hebrew of the prophets, former prophets like Samuel, latter prophets like Amos and Hosea. They seem to be, yes, monarchic period works, but for whatever reason, in terms of the features that I and some other people have discussed, typologically, they look like CBH2, not CBH1. And again, in some cases, Samuel is often talked about, the Masoretic edition of Samuel is often talked about as a textually dubious form of the book. Maybe that can explain some features. Maybe some of the features are secondary. But again, when you have a number of features, textual issues cannot explain all of those.
Okay, incredible. So I want lastly to cover just this topic about the composition of Pentateuch. So how was the Torah actually formed, and how many sources do you recognize in its composition? Did we move forward in some direction regarding the previous consensus in the past few decades, or what is our best knowledge today?
Well, I suspect that if we're looking for consensus, we actually have less now than we used to have. there are experts who still hold to a documentary hypothesis, some quite a classical version of that, and there are some neo-documentarians who still hold to a documentary hypothesis, uh, but are agnostic about dates and things like this. And I suspect that a number of biblical scholars for whom um, the documentary composition is not their main area of study, and also diachronic linguistics is not their main area of study. I would imagine if you surveyed them, they would say that that theory still holds a lot of explanatory power. And by the way, it does. I'm not really an adherent to that. I studied under somebody who was, and I was very glad to do that. I wanted to get a really strong teaching on the documentary hypothesis, and I did. I studied with Baruch Schwartz, and he did a great job, and he's definitely a very convinced kind of neo documentarian. And of course, that approach explains a lot of data in ways that in ways that are better than some other approaches, or maybe all other approaches in some cases. Um, I I think I still found myself and still feel myself somewhat unconvinced. But so in my book, I feel obligated to deal with the documentary hypothesis and to test um, what I was arguing against the sources, and to see if any of the purported sources of the Pentateuch patterned typologically later than other sources in the Pentateuch. And generally, I found the answer to be no. Of course, they're sufficiently different. If you think they're actually discrete sources, they're sufficiently different for documentarians to tell the difference. But they're not different in a way that one is clearly later than the other. So I kind of just, for purposes of argument, I accepted a JEDP and, where necessary, H division. This is not in practice how I kind of think about the Torah. It's not something that I actively kind of pursue. I just felt like I needed to be responsible, and because this is still an important viewpoint, I needed to subject my own research to comparison to that point of view. I suspect that there are sources in the Pentateuch. I suspect there are lots of sources, various kinds. I don't have a solid view on what we should do instead of the documentary hypothesis. As I said, as a theory, it does explain a good many features of the Pentateuch, and to tear it down, to kind of say that it's a wrong theory, one should probably have an alternative theory instead. And I don't really have one. That doesn't mean there isn't one. It's just not my area of expertise. I think what I have tried to contribute, or what other or what I have accepted other people working in diachronic linguistics on Hebrew have contributed, is, if there are sources, to me they all appear to be quite early. They appear to be basically substantially monarchic period sources, possibly based on even older traditions, but there you go. And I don't, in my own recent work, yeah, I don't see much diachronic difference, much typological difference in the language of the sources as they're traditionally divided. So beyond that, I don't really have much to contribute.
Yes, that's really honest. I like that because many of them are so confident in that theories, they almost certain. So yeah, do you see a difference between holiness code and the rest of the P source? Would you see that this is something divided by centuries or something like that, or is it same for you linguistically speaking?
I can't, yeah, linguistically, I can't say that one is substantially older than the other. Um, I was again, it's not my cup of tea. But to try and be responsible, I try to interact with um, theories on this, and so I'm aware of Israel Knoll and Jacob Milgram, the debate that they had, and I think eventually came to some kind of agreement on the thing. Um, and I think both of them, and this is on non-linguistic, or at least maybe it includes linguistic grounds, but for them it's more to do with with the cult and with ideas and culture and things like this. Um, I'm aware of these arguments, and I'm very appreciative of the work that scholars like them have done. And I think my own research, linguistic research, it it doesn't do much beyond what I've already said. It seems to indicate that both sources are pre-exilic. It seems to indicate that they're approximately the same typology as other putative sources in the Torah, and that's about all the kind of the linguistic work that I do um, can do. Now, again, there might be now, and there might come in the future further linguistic evidence that that clarifies things further. But yeah, uh, I I understand the reasons why people say that there's an H code and that it's separate from P, and they have different agendas or different emphases. And I understand the reasons why someone would want to put one earlier or one later. My understanding is that based on my own research and some other people's research that's non-linguistic, is that they can be put in a pre-exilic period. They can be put in a CDH1 uh, context, and they work both linguistically and culturally, historically.
Amazing, Professor Hornkohl. Okay, my last question about all this is about dating P source, because many of scholars would point that that's from exilic period, but you quoted in your book, Professor Rensburg and many more, that they would date maybe 10th century, maybe Avi Hurwitz would say 8th century. So yeah, there are many theories. So what do you think about dating that late as an exilic or maybe even later. So
Yeah, so when scholars all the way back to the time of Wellhausen um, talked about this material, um, saying that it was either exilic or post-exilic, they seem to be doing so on the basis of a kind of theme of emphasis on the importance of the cult and priestly service. And of course, at the time, scholars responded. Some were convinced, but some were very unconvinced. And scholars pointed out differences between the expectation in priestly material and the reality that, say, was depicted in Ezra or depicted in Ezekiel. Because Ezra and Ezekiel both emphasize priestly themes and practice and things like this. So, but on the linguistic side, Wellhausen didn't say very much. One thing he did was point out a list of names. He pointed out a list of names in the book of Numbers, and he said these look like names that we would find in the post-exilic period. Now, the list of names he pointed out, they actually don't appear in Chronicles, because he said they look like names from Chronicles. Now, they don't appear in Chronicles, but his point is these look like, they look similar to names that we do find in Chronicles. So that was a really, it's very meager kind of linguistic evidence. And my own view is, if you're talking about onomastics, actually there's quite a difference. We've talked about that already. Chronicles, like all of late biblical Hebrew and a good portion of classical biblical Hebrew, has a lot of names that have the theophoric component, Yah, Yo, Yahu, things like this. Actually, in Chronicles, it's more Yah than, no, more Yahu than Yah, but the Chronicles also has a significant portion of Yah. But, and then in the priestly material, you just don't have those kinds of names. So if you're actually looking at names, the priestly material is quite different from Ezekiel and quite different from Chronicles. Avi Horovitz was the one to write on this extensively. He didn't discuss names. He discussed lexical features, especially between Ezekiel and P. And so and what he found is that when they had distinctions in their morphology and in their lexicon, where words were substituted for other words, it was consistently Ezekiel that presented the typologically late picture. And also Ezekiel is not considered late biblical Hebrew. It's considered some kind of transitional form of Hebrew between classical and late biblical Hebrew. And so Ezra is even later. And so Horovitz, I think, already, some decades ago, showed pretty clearly, pretty convincingly that that P is not written in LBH. It's not written in late biblical Hebrew. Now, again, most scholars would agree with that. A few scholars here and there will point out features in P that they think are late, but there's no accumulation of late features in P like there is in Ezra and even in Ezekiel. Now, then, of course, we might have a disagreement. People might say, oh, but the writer of P is the exception. He's the one kind of late biblical Hebrew writer who's capable of writing classical biblical Hebrew. And they might say he does it on the basis of non-P material in the Pentateuch, whether you call that non-P material or JE, whatever. So the thing is that you kind of can't have it both ways. If he does it on the basis of non-P material, then his material shouldn't look like P. It should look like non-P, because he's using them for as an example. It doesn't look like that. That's why scholars claim to be able to distinguish between P and non-P. So he's not basing himself on something else, evidently. He's writing good classical biblical Hebrew, but it's not on the basis of J and E or non-P. So here we go back to this impasse, this disagreement that scholars have. People on one side saying it's very unlikely that someone could reproduce classical biblical Hebrew, such an extent of classical biblical Hebrew as P, which is a large part of, Genesis, a large part of Exodus, both in the narrative and in the legal material, and then huge parts of Leviticus and Numbers, and do it so well without betraying his late date. So I find that difficult to accept. Other scholars find it easier to accept. So regarding a late date of the P material, if you admit that there is a P material, if you accept that that's a thing, then I find that difficult to accept that it's late. Exactly where to place it chronologically, in terms of absolute chronology, again, that's harder to do. Relative chronology, I still find it's part of CBH1. Where to draw the line between CBH1 and 2, not sure. Is it 8th century? Is it 10th century? I don't feel like my linguistic procedures, my linguistic approach is precise enough to say that with certainty. It looks pre-exilic to me. It looks like CBH1 to me. That means it's more like the work of the Torah, the other works in the Torah, than it is like Samuel, Kings, etc. But beyond that, I can't say.
Thank you. Is that same for Deuteronomy? Because this source is often dated maybe in 5th century, maybe in the time of Josiah, 600. So that is later than CBH1. So
it's later than the CBH1 according to the dates that I have been working with. I don't know. This has come up recently in the conversation in engagement I've had with some other scholars. I'm still thinking about this. The Josianic reforms do seem to be in the form of Deuteronomy style reformations, Deuteronomy style things, and a number of scholars hold that something like the book of Deuteronomy is what's being referred to in the passage where it says that a book of the law was found in the temple. Certainly in terms of thematics, that is the case. Linguistically, even though Deuteronomy is a different genre than the rest of the Torah, because it's this long speech that is in Moses's mouth. Again, in terms of the typological features that I have been looking at in my work, it patterns like the rest of the Torah. So it looks like CBH1, and I don't know how to reconcile that with the idea that, well, some scholars have that the book of the law that was found in the temple wasn't really found, right? It was that this is a nice way of saying that someone during the time actually wrote up legal material. So I don't. That doesn't seem to reconcile with the data that I have, because what happens then if that's CBH1 and it goes all the way to the time of Josiah, and if after that I need some room for transitional biblical Hebrew before we get to late biblical Hebrew, I'm running out of time. I'm running out of space. So yeah, there are a lot of factors to consider, and this is one of the reasons I was so reluctant to throw out dates. But I think it's fine if you do speculate on dates. You just tell people that's what you're doing. You're just being transparent and kind of showing your work. And as long as you do that, then someone else can come along and say, okay, this is why he did that. This is probably needs to be tweaked, and so we need to do something different. So yeah, that's where I am regarding that question. It's a very good question, and and one I'm still thinking about. Yeah.
Great, Professor Hornkohl. Do you have any conclusion or message or anything to add for our audience?
Yeah, I think so. I teach a course here to final year undergraduate students and graduate students. I call it Biblical Hebrew in Historical Perspective, and we go over some of the texts that we've been talking about, but we also I expose students to extra biblical material from Iron Age inscriptions to rabbinic age texts and Samaritan Hebrew, all different kinds of things. And one of the things I tell them at the beginning is I kind of have two types of students in mind. There are students for whom this approach is going to be very important in the sense that they might actually write research on things like this, and for them, they need to make sure that they hold to robust methodological procedures and make sure that they are acquainted with and using all of the sources available to them. I mean, all of the ancient languages and sources available. But that's probably a small minority of people. Probably the majority of people are not going to become historical linguists dealing with biblical Hebrew or classical Hebrew. They're probably more interested in the Bible more generally or in some other discipline that has to do with the Bible. So for people like that, I don't expect them necessarily to become experts in all the things we've been talking about. I would, however, expect them to avail themselves of as much data as possible. And what that means is not to privilege kind of the linguistic evidence over other evidence, but to certainly to take notice of what kind of research is going on the linguistic side of things, and to be very transparent when it comes to whether their own approach that's non-linguistic agrees with or disagrees with the conclusions that people like me have reached. I don't expect every procedure or every approach to agree with every other approach, but I think it is important that we say both on both sides, on the linguistic side of things, non-linguistic side of things, we say that, oh, by the way, this approach contradicts another approach or is contradicted by another approach. Whereas I think what often happens is we work in quite a siloed way and in somewhat in isolation, and we just put out our theory and don't necessarily note where it's in agreement with or is contradicted by other evidence or other interpretations of evidence. So, yeah, I would just like to see. I hope in my own work that I am taking account of views from beyond kind of my own theories and my own approach, even though I recognize that it's very difficult to be an expert in every field, and it's quite difficult to stay updated on what's going on in fields that are not your own. But I would also like to see in a field like biblical studies where linguistic approaches are considered quite technical and so often not taken into consideration, or because linguistic approaches sometimes lead to uncomfortable conclusions, they're ignored. So rather than be ignored, if linguistic approaches result in conclusions that are at odds with other approaches, I would like the other people of the other approaches to say, yes, the linguists say this, this is in contradiction to what our approach says, and I think that's enough. That's just kind of transparent and honest, and it shows that someone is actually aware of other approaches. And by the way, in a recent one of the recent blogs that I saw, Benjamin Sushad's blog, he does a very, very nice job of integrating linguistic and non-linguistic information, and very respectfully kind of deals with everybody, myself, but also other people that he's talking about. And I think that's a nice model for how to do this. And hopefully in my own work, I'm being respectful of other people as well.
Great message. Thank you so much, Professor Hornkohl. That brings us to the end of today's episode. So we are grateful to you for shedding light on the linguistic layers of Hebrew Bible, formation of Pentateuch, diachronic development of Hebrew. So many topics and many new information. So dear audience, if you found this discussion helpful, consider sharing this episode with others, leaving a comment, or supporting our work. So as always, thank you for listening to the NT podcast. Greetings from Serbia. Goodbye.